For years, the relationship between Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban was held up as proof that love could survive anything: distance, pressure, even personal demons. To the public, they were more than just a couple. They were a symbol. Red carpets, award shows, quiet moments captured by cameras. All of it painted a picture of devotion that felt almost untouchable. But behind that polished image, something far more complicated had been unfolding, slowly and quietly, until it reached a breaking point that neither of them could ignore anymore. When the news of their split finally surfaced, it didn't explode in the dramatic way people might expect from celebrities of their status. There were no shouting matches caught on camera, no scandalous revelations dropped overnight. Instead, it came with a kind of quiet finality that made it feel even more real. And as details began to emerge, it became clear that what looked like a sudden ending was actually the result of years of tension, compromise, and emotional exhaustion building beneath the surface. Nicole had always been someone who valued control, not in a cold or calculated way, but in a deeply personal sense. Her past had shaped her into someone who needed stability, someone who understood how quickly life could unravel when that stability disappeared. Long before Keith entered her life, she had already experienced the kind of heartbreak that leaves lasting marks. Those experiences didn't just fade away. They influenced how she loved, how she trusted, and how she held on to the people closest to her. Keith, on the other hand, lived in a different rhythm entirely. His life revolved around music, performance, and the constant movement that comes with it. There was a freedom in the way he approached life, but also a restlessness that never fully settled. Even during the happiest moments of their marriage, that difference between them remained. A quiet contrast between her need for grounding and his instinct to keep moving. At first, that contrast seemed to work in their favor. She gave him stability, and he brought energy and passion into her life. It felt like balance. But over time, that same dynamic began to shift. What once felt like support started to feel like pressure. What once felt like excitement started to feel like unpredictability. And slowly, the space between them grew, not in obvious ways, but in the small, everyday moments that often matter the most. Those close to them began to notice subtle changes long before anything became public. There were fewer shared appearances, fewer spontaneous displays of affection, fewer glimpses of the easy connection they once had. When they were together, everything still looked perfect, but there was a sense that something underneath had changed. It wasn't something you could point to directly. It was more of a feeling, something that lingered just beneath the surface. For Nicole, the weight of holding everything together became harder to carry. She had spent years being the steady one, the person who kept things grounded when life became chaotic. But that role comes at a cost. Over time, it can start to feel less like love and more like responsibility. And at some point, she began to question whether she was still in a partnership, or whether she had become the one holding it all in place on her own. Keith, meanwhile, was dealing with his own internal struggles. Even when things seemed stable from the outside, there were always challenges he had to face privately. The demands of his career, the expectations placed on him, and the pressure maintaining a certain image all added up. And in moments when he felt overwhelmed, the distance between him and Nicole seemed to widen even further. What made their situation more difficult was the fact that neither of them wanted to be the one to admit that things were falling apart. For years, they had built a life together that people admired. Walking away from that wasn't just about ending a relationship. It meant letting go of an identity they had created as a couple. And that's not something anyone does easily. So instead of confronting the truth head-on, they tried to hold on to what they had. They continued to show up together when it mattered. They continued to speak about each other with respect and affection. They continued to play their roles, even as the reality behind those roles became harder to ignore. But there comes a point in every relationship where effort alone isn't enough. And for them, that point arrived quietly, without a dramatic turning moment. It was more like a realization that slowly became impossible to deny. The connection they once had wasn't the same anymore. The balance that once held them together had shifted too far. When Nicole finally made the decision to step away, it wasn't impulsive. It came after a long period of reflection, of weighing what she wanted against what she was experiencing. And perhaps most importantly, it came from a place of understanding that staying in something that no longer works can be more damaging than letting it go. In the aftermath, what stood out wasn't anger or resentment. It was honesty, not in the form of direct statements or public accusations, but in the choices they made and the way they carried themselves. Keith's performances, for example, began to feel different. There was an emotional edge to them that hadn't been there before, as if he was processing everything in real time through his music. For fans, those moments felt revealing. Lyrics took on new meanings. Expressions felt more intense. It was as though the stage had become a place where unspoken feelings could finally surface. And while he never explicitly explained everything, the emotion was enough to tell its own story.
Nicole, on the other hand, chose a quieter approach. She didn't rush to share her side or respond to speculation. Instead, she focused on what mattered most to her: her family, her work, and her sense of self. But even in her silence, there was something powerful. It wasn't avoidance. It was a decision to move forward without turning her personal life into a spectacle. That contrast between them, his openness through expression and her restraint through silence, highlighted the differences that had always existed between them. Differences that once complemented each other, but eventually became harder to reconcile. As more details emerged, it became clear that their separation wasn't about one single issue. It was about accumulation. Years of small disagreements, unmet expectations, emotional fatigue, all of it adding up over time. And while there was still respect between them, respect alone isn't always enough to sustain a marriage. What makes their story resonate with so many people is how real it feels beneath the celebrity surface. It's easy to look at famous couples and assume their lives are completely different, but at the core, the challenges they faced are deeply human. The struggle to stay connected, the difficulty of balancing individuality with partnership, the pain of realizing that love alone isn't always enough. These are things people everywhere can understand. In the end, what Nicole revealed wasn't a scandal or a dramatic secret. It was something more subtle, but perhaps more impactful. The reality that even the strongest relationships can reach a point where continuing forward together is no longer the healthiest choice. And that choosing to walk away doesn't erase what was shared. It simply acknowledges that something has changed. For Keith, the journey now seems to be about rediscovery, channeling emotion into his music, reconnecting with himself outside of the relationship, and figuring out what the next chapter looks like. For Nicole, it's about reclaiming space, focusing on stability, and continuing to build a life that aligns with who she is now, not who she was when the relationship began. Their story doesn't end with a dramatic conclusion. It ends with two people going their separate ways after nearly 2 decades of trying to make it work. And in that sense, it's not just a story about love. It's a story about growth, about change, and about the difficult decisions that come with both. And maybe that's what makes it so compelling. Not the idea that everything fell apart, but the understanding that sometimes letting go is the most honest thing two people can do.